Somebody asked about a rich text control. TMS software has a rich text control as part of their set of FireMonkey components. So go to tmssoftware.com and you can buy their products and their components and add rich text into your application. Let's see. Does ListView component have drag and drop functionality? There is. We support drag and drop on desktop platforms, so Windows and OS 10, and I put in a link to a blog, an external blog about dropping rectangles on a FireMonkey form, and there is a property for drag site for TListView as well. I don't think we have a specific TListView, but I love these questions because it always gives me things to think about. Writing blog posts with sample code for some of that. Does FD Memtable have nested dataset? Yes, it does. It supports nested datasets, and you can go into the FireDAC doc wiki. I'll find that link and put it in the blog post. And then in there, look at the TFD Memtable component, and there's a section in there that shows you about nested datasets and how to process them and use them. Let's see, Jim, there was this one about the REST client library, which wasn't necessarily focus of this getting started with mobile, but you may in your mobile app need to go out to a REST server to get some data and then bring it back. You have the REST client, the REST response, and the REST response dataset adapter so that you can make a REST call, get the JSON back, put it into an FD Memtable. That would be great, or you can just process the JSON directly. But if you want to go to different tables and you have live bindings, again, the whole live bindings mechanism, you can set a specific live binding on a specific string grid or table, whatever it might be. But you can also use code to take data and bind it at runtime to a string grid. So it's just a matter of changing the binding that is connected to the string grid. You can do that in code. You can do that at design time if you're going to do a one-time only binding. But you can always do it. You can even populate the string grid not using live bindings by processing through the fields and working with the properties of the string grid columns and column editor to set the sizes appropriately and so on. Anything else on the REST, I think? Separate requests for different services, right, Jim? But then after that,
he was asking if you had to have separate requests and responses.
Yeah.
Usually, that's the best practice, is to have a separate request and response for each table you're pulling down, each set of data you're pulling down. But you don't have to. I would recommend doing that, but you could reuse the same one over and over again. And because once it's pulled down the data set and ran through the dataset adapter into the FD Memtable and then displayed in the grid, you could then disconnect it from the adapter and change the settings to pull it from a different endpoint. You're not really buying yourself a whole lot by doing that, but it certainly is an option. So I would recommend having separate requests and responses and dataset adapters for each one so that you can funnel that all into their own FD Memtables.
Yeah, there was a question about XML support. We have XML document component, and with that, you can then walk through the tree. We give you the choice of different XML parsers. I think, what's the one we use these days across multiple platforms? You know, Windows, you can use MS XML. As
Omni XML DOM.
Omni XML DOM is the one to choose if you want great XML parsing across all the different platforms that we support. And that's just a property choice when you drop down the component, the non-visual component for XML.
And that's really, you can do a lot of great stuff with XML. The XML support's top-notch.
Let's see. Okay. There was a question, and it was a good one, Jim. Maybe you have some thoughts. It was about, you know, if you have different target devices. So, for example, a phone versus a tablet, let's say on Android or iOS for that matter, but let's say Android specifically. You go in and you set the permissions, for example, like phone permission, internet permissions, Bluetooth permissions, and so on. You set those choices, but how would you go about setting different permissions based on different target devices? And I've given a couple ideas. One would be to create 2 target nodes and have different permission settings. Use the same source code for your projects, but use different permissions for each of the target projects in a project group. I don't know of another conditional way.
I'm not sure I understand different permissions.
Well, for example, if you wanted to access the phone, but your tablet didn't have a phone.
Oh.
It was just a Wi-Fi versus a Wi-Fi and whatever they call it, 3G, 4G, whatever. I don't know any conditional way when your app first starts up other than checking platform services interfaces to see if there's a phone.
There's probably a conditional. No, I don't think there's a conditional defined for a tablet versus a phone. So you'd really want to use platform services at that point.
Yeah. You use platform services and you're on Create. That's how FireMonkey works itself under the covers. It goes out and looks at what services are available on the running platform. Does it have a menu service? Does it have a mouse service? Does it have a dialogue service? Those kinds of things to know what FireMonkey will allow you to do or not in your application. You can use those same services. I've done videos and blogs about that. I'll dredge up one of those. I was thinking more if for example, you had a device that didn't have Bluetooth, not that anybody has it, and you're turning on Bluetooth. I don't think Android would stop you. Would it stop you? That's just guidance to the customers, right? I mean, when they install saying, hey, this application wants to do all these things.
That's a good question. I'd have to find a device that doesn't have Bluetooth. If you tried to make a call to a library that didn't exist, I think it might give you an error message. I really don't know. Yeah. I haven't tried in a while.
Yeah, I'll have to do that on I'll take my Samsung Galaxy phone, and I've got a Nexus 7 tablet that doesn't have a phone part, right? It's just a Wi-Fi tablet, and see what happens there. Let's see. The upgrade special offers for any version of our products. So if you've got a 2007 Delphi or a Delphi 7 or whatever, the 45% off the list price offer is good until June 20th. Peter says his head hurts. Yeah, it's a lot to cover in getting started. In the past, we've done, all day getting started, summer schools, mobile summer schools. So I'll put links to some of those. We wanted to give you into in a shorter, quick form, at least that top level look, especially Serena's section on all the different things you want to think about in a mobile UI UX experience. I've put links to several of the DocWiki entries, as well as I put links to the Apple and Android user interface guidelines that are those are in the blog post. And Serena, if you're still there, I know we talk about the user interface guidelines and how FireMonkey enforces some of that. The guidance, do you have additional guidance for people? Use FireMonkey. We do the work that makes sure that you don't violate a lot of those UI UX guidelines.
Yeah, with the built-in, that's correct. With the built-in behavior services, it's really easy to ensure that, for example, tabs are positioned in the correct positions. For example, tabs on Android should be top aligned with text, on iOS bottom aligned with text and icons. And that is enabled automatically using behavior services in FireMonkey. So if you're using the FireUI multi-device designer by going to File, New, Multi-Device Application, and you switch between any of the operating systems, so even on the master screen, if you switch on the master phone between iOS and Android, you'll see that the tabs will automatically reposition themselves. In addition to that, if you're getting started building mobile applications, when you go to File, New, Multi-Device Application, you can choose from pre-built templates. And those templates are a really good starting point as they help you get started laying out your application. The same is also true if you're looking at the multi-device samples that we include with the product. Those include a variety of different types of user interface designs that show you how to best work with alignments, anchors, T layouts, etc. So going to the multi-device samples folder that is installed as part of the samples directory with RadStudio, and then navigating to multi-device samples and the user interface folder, you'll find many great examples that you can have a look at. For example, the settings demo I showed you today, and other demos that provide a good overview of best practices when it comes to mobile application design.
Yep. There's a question about a percent in margin or padding like in CSS. We're not CSS or HTML based, but each FireMonkey component has a margins property where you can set a number of pixels on the top, bottom, left, right, Serena?
That's correct. And if you, for example, if you're creating a segmented control, you would use the T layout, align that to the center, for example, on a toolbar, and then you would parent your speed buttons to that and then set alignments on each of the buttons. The same is also true if you have a toolbar with a title and you have a right-aligned, for example, refresh button, as I showed in my slides, and then a left-aligned recycle or trash button, for example. You would want to set margins in both of those because that ensures that the icons look very nice on the toolbar and they don't run up too close to the right or left side of your form, so they're easily accessible with somebody's finger to be able to activate that button, tap it, etc. So in general, it's really good. It's really important to use alignments and anchors. Anchors ensure that that position that you've set for the control remains across different form factors. So for example, anchoring a button to the top right. But in general, if you have a container control like a toolbar, for example, that you're parenting other controls to like a button and labels, you definitely want to set alignments for all of those controls. And if you have a title on a toolbar, you want to align that to contents. And if you have buttons, you want to align them to right and left. And my slides also that showed the best practices, I believe we will be putting them up on SlideShare, David, is that correct?
Yeah, I'll put them up on SlideShare, and I'll put the slides, the link to SlideShare in the blog post. So again, embt.co/mobile start now, capital MSN, mobile start now. And that shortcut is also in the blog post, but anyway, that doesn't really help you. So I will absolutely do that. There was, Jim, I think it was confusion about the live preview versus you can create custom views inside of the form designer for FireMonkey. But maybe you saw that question. It might have been answered because it disappeared for me. Oh, it was, here it is. It's like there was the iOS preview tool or emulator. Was that just preview with the Fire UI preview? Maybe you just take a step back.
Oh.
The File UI live preview versus creating master views in the designer versus, again, running on a simulator or on the device.
So what the live preview does, it lets you actually view your changes live on the device. So you can, in the IDE, you can say, I want to show me what this looks like in the IDE for iOS or for Android or for Windows. You can make those configuration changes there. But if you want to actually see what it's going to look like on the actual device, how the device is going to render it, then that's where live preview comes in. So it's really the evolution of all the cool design features we've had in Fire UI, coming of age, if you will, all these great new features to make you more productive, to see what your UI is going to look like.
And
so
under the covers, it uses our app tethering technology, right, for Wi-Fi, not Bluetooth. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, it does not use Bluetooth, although as I showed you, it has the source code there, so I guess technically you maybe could make it work with Bluetooth. I don't know. Let's see, there's a limitation on Bluetooth on iOS, so if you wanted to only do it on Android, maybe you could do Bluetooth. Well, you don't have the source code on the IDE side, so never mind. Yeah, it's just Wi-Fi.
Yep. And we have one, and Serena, because you went through this about just using our standard components for live preview. There's an app that you can download from the iOS store and the Google Play Store. Is that right?
That's correct. So we have a Fire UI app Preview application that you can download from both the Android Google Play Store and the Apple App Store for iOS. So if you are looking to see what your application is going to look like on each of the target devices and you don't want to first deploy the demo application and the source code that we provide for the live preview application yourself, you can go to the App Store, download the respective apps for either iOS and Android, and then connect to the IDE like Jim showed earlier using the IP address of your Windows machine. So as Jim showed earlier, if you're downloading this, if you're downloading the app through the App Store and to install it on your phone or tablet, you'll want to make sure that you're on the same subnet, and then you're able to connect to the IP address of your development machine, and then you're able to see all the changes you're making live in the IDE on the actual devices that have those applications installed. Alternatively, you could also deploy the application, the Fire UI app preview application, to those devices yourself. But if you're just looking to do a quick test, for example, or you're not using any third-party components, you can go ahead and download and install the applications from the app stores. If you're using third-party components in your application, then you want to use the sample code and the actual application that we provide so that you're able to deploy it yourself. And Jim, what are some tips that you would recommend users do if they're using third-party components and they want to be able to preview on device those third-party UI components?
And so what you would need to do is you would probably drop the component on the form on another application and see what units get used, and then you can take those units, modify the regs.pass file to add those units in there, and then add the line to register the component so it's available, the classes that are going to be instantiated. The spreadsheet had a specific extra line we had to add there in order to create the series, populated series list. But yeah, that's what you need to do, and then you just redeploy it. Make sure that if you did install from the App Store, you uninstall that first from your device. Otherwise, you could get an error message about signature mismatches of packages and stuff, I'm sure. So uninstall the existing one if it's from the App Store, rebuild it. Oh, you can copy the source code from the source directory under program files to like your project folder or something like that, so that you can make changes to it, and you'll be good to go.
Yep.
It was one of those things that I was like, oh, this is all that's involved, and I tried it, and it worked for me on the first. Actually, I didn't work the first time because I didn't have all the code in there. I thought I did, and then I ran it and didn't do it. But once I put the code in there, like I showed you, it works. It's easy to do.
Yep. Okay. So Serena, this one's for you. We were talking about margins around different visual controls in FireMonkey. There's the margins property. Jens is mentioning, wouldn't a layout control, I mean, there's many ways to do things like margins and percentages of alignments, right?
Layout, yes, that's correct. You can use a layout. You can set margins on each of the controls. You can use anchors and alignments. If you're creating a home screen type layout, you can use a grid panel layout, and you're able to define the percentage that each column and row takes up as part of that grid panel layout. And of course, if you're looking to adjust settings specifically to a form factor, I saw this as another related question that someone else asked, you can go into the FireUI Multi-Device Designer. So if you're going to File, New Multi-Device Application, the first thing you're presented with is the master form. And you also see a drop-down menu. And this drop-down menu lets you customize the UI, and it's based on the master form, but you're able to customize the UI for that particular phone form factor. So for example, to answer your question here, I saw about 3.5-inch device. You can select an iOS 3.5-inch device, and the same for Android. You'll see at design time what that application, what the UI is going to look like. And then you're able to adjust margins, etc., depending on, for example, the text length that you have on a control. So this is a really great way for you to be able to fully customize the UI for a particular phone form factor at design time. And then you can use the live preview on device if you wanted to see what the application is going to look like live on the device as you're making those types of adjustments instead of actually deploying the device to the application to your physical device.
There's a question here for you, Jim, I think. As you were showing EMS talking to remote database, what about security, security risks?
Yeah, I did not go into security at all, just for simplicity's purposes, but EMS supports authentication, and EMS supports using HTTPS TLS to secure it all. So there are lots of security options. I believe we've covered it in some of our other webinars, but in this one I just wanted to show really quick how you could connect to a remote database. But definitely security is important. There's quite a few ways you could handle that. You can also, if security is really important to you, then you want to use Interbase on your local database instead of SQLite, because Interbase with IB2Go supports full database encryption as well. So then you can encrypt your data at rest on the device, as well as encrypting it on the wire using SSL TLS, and and secure it on the server using authentication. So lots of options there for securing all that data. Just that would have been an entire hour long just going through how to do all that stuff is what there as well. But yeah, it's totally supported.
And Serena, for you, it's either Jim or Serena, I think. I keep answering myself, but I'll leave it to you guys. About the master views versus the device views, and ideas, as you've already said, about handling the scaling on different form factors of devices. That's what the master view and device views are for in the designer, right? Serena? Or Jim? Or me?
Right. So yeah, you use the device-specific views in order to. So the reality is, usually, if you you're going to lay out your master view, put all your components on there first, and set your anchors and your alignment and your padding, and that's going to get you like 90% of the way there for different size phones. The place that's going to get a little more interesting is when you go from a phone to a tablet, because you have so much more real estate on a tablet, you may decide you want to change your layout out. So you're going to add a tablet layout, and you're going to change things around there. Then you're going to go through and preview it on each of the devices and say, oh, look, on this device, it's a little crowded here, so you're going to just do a little tweaking. But ideally, as much as you can do on the master layer is great, because then it propagates down and it goes across everything. But then if you do need to have a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of more margins, etc., you can do that with the device-specific views, and it saves you a lot of time. And I've used some of the other development systems for developing applications across multiple devices. Like, for example, on iOS, you would create an iPad view or an iPad UI and an iPhone UI completely separate. You have to build them all from the ground up. On Android, you can use fragments, but you would end up building different UIs for the tablet versus the phone, and for different phone form factors, and you should end up with this huge collection of things we would be re-implementing it over and over and over again. And of course, then even if you make it once and copy it, you make a change to the top level one, and all of a sudden, oh, I got to change all these again. So this is a huge advancement and much easier development path than you would get with any of the development tools out there, as far as the flexibility and the speed to getting things done.
Yeah, and to add to that, if you want to execute any platform-specific code, you can still use and design your application on the master form, and then go down to each of the views. For example, you could go to your iPhone view, and you could set up specific event handlers if you wanted the iPhone application for some reason to behave differently than your Android application. So FireUI Multi-Device Designer really provides a lot of flexibility. In general, I would recommend laying out most of the application on the master. If you have a situation where you want to show more controls, for example, on an iPad and an iPhone due to the screen real estate, you could go to the iPhone form factor from the drop-down menu, and then you can just change the visibility of some of the controls to false. So for example, if you had more UI options on an Android on your tablet application than your phone application, you could go to that particular phone form factor, select your T button, for example, or your T list view, and then you could change the visibility of that control to false. And that also allows you to adjust the types of controls that you show on each of the form factors while still designing the bulk of your application on the master itself.
And the thing Serena pointed out about the fact you can have different event handlers on different device-specific views, that's really important to remember that, because I've had done that before, and then I go to the master and I'm like, oh, I'll just change this event handler or go into this event handler and add some code, and then I'm running it on a specific device that has a specific view for that device with an event handler specific for that device, and I'm like, why is this button click not doing what I expected to do? And it drives me bonkers. And then I realize, oh, wait, there's a different event handler on that button click for the iPad than there is for the iPhone, and then you fix it, and everything works beautifully again. So that's important to remember that. If you do go on that path, you want to make sure that you remember that you've done that.
And to add to that, it's not required. It's just something that provides a lot of customizability. So, for example, if you are loading data from a different data source on iOS for some reason than on Android, you can set up a different event handler. Or you're sharing an image, for example, and you want to set up a different type of sharing event on Android than you do on iOS, but you don't want to have to redesign your application. You can just go to that form factor from the drop-down menu for Android or iOS and then set up specific event handlers for that particular target platform.
Yeah, there was let's see. There was a question. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was going to say there was a great question, and I think this is a good question for you, Jim, about the number of devices that can be connected to the Fire UI Live preview. What are some best practices or tips and tricks that, based on your experience, Jim, that you would recommend if someone wants to connect, for example, multiple Android devices to the IDE using Live Preview to see what that application is going to look like live on those Android devices?
So I've had actually Android devices I've had pretty good luck with. I found that if I'm connecting a Windows device, so in the video I showed I had an Android device, iPad, a Windows 10 tablet, and the Mac OS 10 all connected. I found the Windows tablet didn't stay connected very well. It tended to disconnect, but Android was pretty reliable as far as staying connected. I didn't try connecting a ton of them, but it should, in theory, work across a few. Just be aware of the fact that it is going to be sending that data out to all those devices. And so if you had 10 devices connected, it's conceivable that it could slow things down because of the fact that it has to stream those changes across to all those devices. But yeah, I was doing 4 devices, and it was being able to, you have 4 different devices connected, and it was updating and working fine for the most part there. So the cool thing is you have the source code for it, and if you encounter ways, maybe you think of ways that you can optimize it to support more devices, you could totally do that. Maybe have a pause button so you could turn off the ones that you don't want updating right now and then turn them back on again later or something. I don't know. Lots of possibilities. But yeah, you should be able to connect a few devices and be able to preview it across multiple devices easily.
Okay, I think we've handled most of the questions. There were a few duplicate and sort of off-topic questions that I'll follow up on in the future. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's most of it. Any last comments, Serena?
I think looking at the slides once we share them on SlideShare will be a good start and kind of a refresher on the UI guidelines and best practices that I showed you today. We also, as I mentioned previously, have a lot of great demos to help you get started. If you go to the samples directory of the samples that are installed with the product. And then I know that all of us on this webinar have done a variety of great blog posts with tips and tricks, frequently asked questions on Fire UI, setup guidelines and steps for configuring your machines, etc. And we have many great videos also on YouTube. If you go to our Embarcadero TechNet YouTube channel, you can search for Fire UI, you can search for best practices, mobile application development, etc. And you'll come across a lot of different great past webinars that we've done on the subject as well to help you get started building your applications.
Yeah, there was a question here about if you have a mobile app and you want to get to Microsoft SQL Server, Microsoft doesn't provide a static library for mobile devices for talking to remote SQL Server databases. So you'll need to create either a DataSnap server or an EMS server or a REST server of your own, SOAP server, whatever, and then call from your mobile app to that service. EMS server, for example, Jim showed, or DataSnap server. In the DataSnap or EMS server, you would have your FireDAC component that talked to your Microsoft SQL server and then did the query, got the data, sent it back via JSON to your mobile app. And we have documents and videos about using DataSnap and EMS server and all of that. So the other thing is come to our webinar on June 16th. We're doing a deeper dive into the source code of using RAD server. We also have the replay from last month of the RAD server launch. I put the link in the Q&A log. So lots of information about that. For DataSnap, Pavel Glavatsky has his DataSnap labs. His Delphi Labs DataSnap, I think it's 11 tutorials about all the different aspects of doing DataSnap multi-tier development. So all of that is there. And let's see. There was a question about, is there a way to set metrics, margins, paddings, and whatever automatically depending on screen size? You could, when your mobile application starts, you could see what the size of your device is, your form factor, and you could then, a FireMonkey form has a components array, and you could iterate through the components array looking for all the visual controls and get to the margins and other settings of your user interface components across the project to set them accordingly. It would take a while because there's a lot of components you'd run through in the components array. So you could do that. Better would be to set up, the alignments and anchors and the views at design time. But if you want to, for example, create a form on the fly in code, people do that. They create forms in code, set the property, set the parent of the form, or the control, and so on. So you could do it many different ways, including that there isn't a sort of magic method to call to say, pass the form factor size, and it goes through and does that for you. That might be a fun sort of reusable library or component that someone might build. But there is the component array on a FireMonkey form so that you could iterate through all the components and do the changes that you want to do to margins and widths and heights and so on. But otherwise, that's what doing the master view and the custom views for the different form factors are. And you can create your own custom form factors as well. We have documentation about that. So you can create additional views if you have some other devices and install those in the IDE so that you can choose those in your for your projects. And the way that all the master view and custom views work is it uses the form inheritance under the covers. You'll see the default form file, and then you'll see statements, uses statements, or not uses, $R statements for each of the additional form factors that you choose, the views, the custom views. And then the linker, depending on the target platform, when you do a build, it'll pull in the master view and the overrides that you created, in a sense, for the custom view for that target device. And then that will become the resource that FireMonkey uses when it runs on that target platform. So it's using under the covers, the form inheritance capability that we've had for years. So it's very cool and simple to do. Master view, custom views for different form factors. And FireMonkey, when it starts up in the startup code, because there's a follow-on question about how does FireMonkey choose the correct form factor. Again, FireMonkey itself, when it starts up, and you can do this in your own code, it checks to see what device it's on, what form factor is available, and it choose it, it tries to load up the closest form factor that it can do. And I think the support, Serena, is for the different resolutions, for example, of Android. 1x, what is it, 1.5, 2? I don't know if there's another one on Android, or Jim. I remember 1.5, and 2x resolution. And on
and 3x, sorry, I was having issues unmuting myself, but yeah, 1x, 1.5x, 2x, and 3x resolutions are automatically built into the styles, and if you're using custom images, for example, you will see that there is a property on T-image that you can easily load in your own custom images. So for example, if you're loading in a background photograph to be used as a background image, you're going to want to make sure that you have that image available in multiple resolutions. One alternative, of course, is to start with a higher res image, but it's really good practice to provide custom images. And this is another good example of using and customizing the layouts for a particular view. So for example, if you're working with a smaller phone form factor and a larger phone form factor, you might want to load a different image or actually resize that image or crop the image differently so that it looks very nice on that phone form factor rather than appearing stretched, for example. So if you have an image and you want that's showing a person, for example, and it doesn't lay out the same on all the different devices because of the different aspect ratios, resolutions, etc., you can go in and select T-image on your iPhone 3.5-inch device, for example, and then select a different image, then go from the drop-down menu in the Fire UI Multi-Device Designer, select iPhone 4.7-inch, for example, and load a different image. So it really provides a lot of customizability as you're building your application.
Is there any policy about mentioning that your app was created using Embarcadero Rad Studio? There's no restrictions. We love it when people say they build with Delphi or C++ Builder or Rad Studio.
Yeah, that's always great.
We have some logos. I'll have to find those and put the link in the blog. We have these built with and powered by logos, so if you want to use those as well, it's great. There was a question about ribbon controls in 10.1, and Marco Cantu did a blog post. I put the URL in. We don't have the ribbon controls. Microsoft has changed their ribbon control policy, so we don't ship the ribbon controls anymore. Inside Marco's blog post, he talks about alternatives that you can explore that are out there in GitHub and other places. So check out that link. Do you have to pay any fees to do for building and deploying a mobile app? No. If you have Rad Studio Professional and above, or if you have Delphi and C++ Builder Enterprise and above, or if you have Delphi or C++ Builder Pro, you can buy the mobile add-on pack, and that gives you the license to build mobile apps and deploy them and sell them and all of that. There were questions about banner ads. We have a T add banner component. We also have, and there was a question about in-app purchase. We have a T in-app purchase component. And somebody was asking about full screen ads and video ads. And we have a tech partner, AirServe, AERSERV. I'll put their link, let's see, in the chat window, but you can just search Google for AirServe, AERSERV. They have a set of components that you can use with Rad Studio and Delphi and C++ Builder. So I'll put their URL in the chat window. Again, it's aerserv.com. Okay. Here was a question, Serena. I sort of answered a little bit. It was a question about why use TListView instead of TreeView on mobile apps. And I mentioned that TreeView has a specific kind of data structure with parent and child, or nodes and subnodes and subnodes. ListView can have multiple, and ListBox can have multiple items in them, but you would have to do, so what would you advise people on UI user experience on ListView, ListBox versus TreeView?
TreeView is really a desktop control. It's really not designed for mobile applications. TListView is very optimized for mobile applications, and you'll see that in things like scrolling performance. It's a very fast scrolling control. We also support native platform rendering for TListView on iOS specifically. So on iOS, you can also render TListView using the underlying operating system. So in general, if you're looking to add a list, the standard type of a list would be to add TListView. Using the new ListView item designer, you could also lay out a grid-like pattern if you wanted to have something that was similar to a grid with columns, for example. You could add a header and then basically place header labels at the top, for example, first name, last name, department, ID number for an employee. And then you could have a list view layout that displayed them side by side. So you would be able to basically represent or create a column-like, grid-like layout, still using and leveraging all the great functionality that TListView provides. And in 10.1 Berlin, we added the ListView item designer that makes it really easy for you to customize your own ListView rows. And so basically, you're able to right-click on TListView to bring up a design mode. And this design mode allows you to add your own custom objects. So, for example, you can add multiple images, multiple text labels, etc., and you can fully customize them the way they look. You can adjust the font, you can adjust the images, you can data bind them programmatically, you can data bind them using the Live Bindings Designer, and then the layout that you've defined is repeated throughout your list, your entire list view. Now, for example, if you're looking to create a settings list, like I showed in one of the screenshots earlier on during my slide deck, and you're looking to add a settings screen, then using TListBox is a really good choice because it has various style options built right in so that you can create a list, a settings list that matches the UI guidelines across iOS and Android. And we have a really great demo that shows you how to do that. It's in the mobile multi-device samples user interface folder called Settings Project, I believe. And you can have a look at that for both C++ and Object Pascal.
I think a couple other things for me on ListView. There's the pull to refresh
Great, yes.
option, and there's the inertia, right? So as
Yes.
you use your finger to zip through a list view of items, it moves at that speed and slows down.
Correct. It has the physics capability built in, and then also it has, as you mentioned, pull to refresh. It also has automatic indexing and searching built in, so it's really a great and very versatile control.
One other thing I've learned is if you're compositing several components into a list view item, use the begin update, end update methods.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you do begin update, composite other components into a list view item, and then call end update, and that way it'll just appear when all of those will appear versus being composited along the way.
Correct. And we actually just added a couple additional ListView specific demos also to our SourceForge repository, and I'm planning on blogging about them soon. One of the demos that we added is an example of how to automatically adjust the item height based on the text. So that was a question that came up in the webinar a couple weeks ago, and we have a new demo that you can find in the ListView folder under multi-device samples user interface ListView. That is a variable item height example. And so basically it adjusts the item height based on the content that is displayed. So if you have more text, the item height, each row height is taller, and if you have less text, it's shorter. So this was something that customers were asking about in the previous webinar. So we created a great demo that shows you how to do that. And I'll make sure to blog about this in the coming days as well. But you can have a look if you go to SourceForge and search for Rat Studio demo code, and then browse to Object Pascal, multi-device samples, user interface ListView. You'll find the demo in that folder.
Then there was a question about background processing on mobile, and for Delphi we support Android services, and we have Sample and Jim McKeith did a blog post and video about doing services on Android. On iOS we added a background modes setting in the version info, so you do in the project options version info, and there's a setting there if you want on iOS. When you select the iOS target of the project options, you'll see it's UI background mode, I think it's called, or modes plural. So check those out for Android and for iOS. So there were a few, let's see. There was a question about, I think there was a back and forth about the best practices for writing a mobile app on Android, and for that matter on iOS, where you have a task-driven or a sequence of user interface activities through your applications. Do you have advice for people how to make sure you don't, what is it here? How many UI rules am I breaking or not?
Well, in general, it's good to adhere to standard paradigms that customers have become accustomed to, because you also reduce the chance of confusion when somebody is using your application. Generally speaking, a good idea would be to use a tab control and a toolbar. So for example, with the tab control, you have various tab position properties. So if you select T-tab control, drop it onto your form, align it to the client, for example, you can go ahead and select a tab position property, and you can select none. None allows you to work with each of the tab pages, and you can show and hide a tab programmatically. So for example, you could place a top aligned toolbar with a next button and a back button, and when you click next, it sets tab control one that, tab item 2 to active, for example, and on the back button it sets tab item 1 to active. So you're able to activate the views or the tabs, so to speak, are part of T-tab control programmatically, and that would be a really good way to allow the user to navigate. As part of that, we also have pre-built actions that are part of the action list control for the tab itself. For example, a slide transition. So you're able to click next, and then you're able to animate as you're moving from tab 1 to tab 2. So that really would be a good way to handle that. We also have scrolling tab support, and I think we have an existing blog post on that. I'll have to have a look, and I think we also have a demo on it. But generally speaking, I would recommend using a toolbar with speed buttons, just like I showed in one of my examples, and I believe the slide deck will be made available later on as well if you'd like to use that as a kind of a reference guide. And then just linking to, programmatically setting and activating each of the tabs. And then you can use a slide transition so you're able to allow the user to navigate. So for example, if you had a patient sign-up form, for example, and on the first screen you ask for their first name and last name and address. On the second screen you ask for, I don't know, symptoms or something like that. On the third screen you ask for employer information. On the fourth screen you ask for insurance card information. You could easily have 4 tabs and allow the user to navigate between them. We have an existing demo. It's called Keyboard Forms. That's also in the multi-device samples user interface folder that you can access, and that one shows you how to navigate between different screens, also using tabs, and has input controls and shows you how to do an input form. So depending on the type of application you're building, this could also be a good example to have a look at.
And then you can use the vertical scroll box if you want to make space for the
Yes,
keyboard to come up?
And we also have another keyboard demo example as well in the multi-device samples user interface folder that shows you how to automatically shift the form up on Keyboard Focus, and I've actually created a couple different blog posts in the past on that as well. So that's another kind of common paradigm that you're seeing when you're using mobile applications, is that as the user taps into an input field, you want to automatically shift up the form so that the keyboard is not covering the input field.
What about using a horizontal scroll box and put aligned buttons on a horizontal scroll box? Would that be acceptable user interface in
It really depends on the platform. I would say on iOS, the guidelines are, they're more specific than on Android. I think on iOS, because there is a human review, somebody actually looking at your application, it's a little bit more of a rigid process than it is on Android. That being said, obviously there are a lot of applications nowadays that don't adhere to any specific guideline, so to speak, but you want to make sure that the application is intuitive. I think that's a key thing to keep in mind, and that you're not cluttering up buttons, and that you don't have, I think a really important thing to keep in mind is, especially if you're coming from desktop application development, is that you don't put too many controls on a small form factor. So maybe if you have a lot of buttons on a toolbar, maybe kind of rethink the process. So instead of having the user slide through those buttons, using a tab control and just having a next and back button on the toolbar and the title, and then allowing the user to navigate through tabs, basically by using invisible tabs. Ultimately, it's of course up to you to decide how you want to build your application, but I think adhering to some of those standards will ensure that your customers have a good experience using the application.
And you covered this, but on tab controls or tabs, on iOS it's what, 4 and a more button?
Yes, so that's another thing, especially on a phone form factor. You don't want to have a situation where you have 6 or 7 or 8 little tabs where the text is truncated and the user can't even see what it says. It's really important. You're not supposed to have more than 5 tabs on a phone form factor. So what that means is, if you need to have more additional navigation beyond 5 tabs, make the 5th tab a more tab. And then on that 5th tab, you can have additional navigation, for example, via the form of multiple list box items. And then each list box item would represent an additional functionality that you want to give the user access to. Alternatively, of course, in addition to using tabs, you could also use the T multi-view control for allowing the user to slide in and out, additional account settings, for example, depending on what other content and functionality you wanted to give the user access to. So that's really up to you, but we've created a lot of good examples that are available with the product and that we've blogged about. If you look on the community.embarcadero.com, you can also search for frequently asked questions around Fire UI. A while back I created a good post on that kind of gave you the tips and tricks around building multi-device applications, what to keep in mind, how to properly or best adjust each form factor depending on the target device and platform. So there's a lot of great content that we've created, and also on YouTube as well if you go to our YouTube channel, to help you get started.
I love T multi-view.
Yes, it's a great control. Yeah. And the really nice thing about T multi-view is it has these automatic presentation types built in. So what that means is on a phone form factor in both portrait and landscape mode, given that it's a small form factor, even though phones are getting bigger and bigger, it's still relatively speaking a small form factor. It will automatically slide in as a drawer, and we have different types of settings. You can set it as an overlapping drawer or a pushing drawer where it basically pushes the content over on the form. You can also set the slide speed, etc. And then on a tablet, in portrait mode, it's a slide and drawer, and in landscape mode, it's a docked panel or split view, something a similar layout as you're probably familiar with if you're using, for example, the email client on a tablet, where you would have the inbox displayed on the left and then the contents of the email on the right. And all of those properties are customizable. You can override the default behaviors. It's all up to you to decide what you'd like to do with it, but by default it has kind of the key UI paradigms and standards built into the control to make it really easy for you to have an intuitive user experience across your different multi-device applications just by using the T multi-view control as is.
Let's see. There was a question about guidance for distributing apps outside of the app stores. I asked because of revenue sharing on each platform. I have links to how you can do some of those things. In the case of iOS, you got to go through the iOS store, or inside your firewall have an enterprise store up to 100 devices, and I have the link to that information as well in the blog. On Android, you can put it in the Play Store, but you can also just sell APKs and put them on your own server sites and so on. You can sideload them. So, but on iOS, other than Adhoc Deploy, there's no other way that I know of. Apple really locks that down.
That's correct. Besides it's either the ad hoc deployment, which is really designed for deploying within your enterprise, or the App Store deployment. On Android, as David mentioned, you can either submit it to the App Store, whether that's Google Play or the Amazon App Store, and you can also, install it directly onto a device. You need to make sure if you're installing an APK directly onto a device, and this is your first time doing it, you need to make sure that you go into the settings and enable install apps from unknown sources, I believe is the setting, and that will allow you to install an application that is not being downloaded from the App Store.
Yep. Let's see. A question about translating strings that you use inside of your apps. There's some third-party libraries whose names will probably escape me currently that allow you to provide translation string sets and interfaces that you could load dynamically. You can do that yourself as well on Form Create. For example, go to an INI file or some other data file and populate strings into memory, and then pull from that memory for your show message dialogues and so on. But I'll get some of those translation links. There's at least 2 technology partners that have those. I'll put those in the blog post for you. Let's see. And then as far as the replay, the link will be in the blog post for the webinar once I get the replay after the 3 webinars finish, and I do a little cleanup of things here and there. Let's see. Oh, is there a way to deploy development apps on personal device without going through the App Store? Yeah, just connect a USB cable to your to your Android device or your iOS device and or to your Macintosh and do a release development build, and it's over on your device. If you're inside of a small company, as long as you use the right, each of those devices is provisioned properly in your Xcode, then you could have a new build of an app and have everybody come by your cube, desk, office, whatever, plug them in, do a deploy, do a run or deploy to the device, and you can do it that way. Have your friends come over for a deployment party, whatever it might be. And all the deploy and store links are in the blog post under the section about iOS and Android getting started development. So they're all on the blog post, and we'll keep adding blogs to the blog post as well. Just a USB cable. You can also do a deploy over the network on Android if you want. But let's see. If you have Delphi Berlin Pro, you need to buy the mobile add-on pack.
Correct.
Yep. And that's why you only see Win32, Win64, I guess, in your feature installer if you have the Pro version. Using the Fire UI multi-device preview, why can't you create a live preview using Galaxy S2 and S4? You should be able to, Peter.
You should be
Jim,
able to, and Jim McKeith in the past created some really good blog posts, and I think even videos that showed you the steps of creating your own custom device view that you can install into the IDE.
I mean, Jim has an S3. I have a Galaxy S4. So you send Jim an email. The emails are on the screen, or send me an email. I've got an S4. Jim's got an S3. I'm not sure about an S2. If there's a problem, it could be that you don't have the right Android SDKs installed, API versions installed. So let's see. Let me find a few other ones. So speed buttons versus regular buttons.
Speed buttons are really designed to be used on toolbar controls. So while you could use a T button and it has similar style lookup properties, speed buttons are really designed to be used for toolbar controls. So if you have a toolbar with a parented button, it's recommended that you use a T speed button over T button.
Would Apple kick you out if you put regular buttons on a toolbar?
No, it's no,
Okay.
because they won't know either way what type of button it is as long
Sure.
as you use the proper styling.
Oh.
So, if you have a look at many of our examples, you'll see the types of, style properties that are recommended that you set. And if you have a look at the templates too, if you do file new multi-device application and you select, for example, I think it's called tabbed with navigation. It's a template that uses a toolbar, tabs, animated slide transitions, etc. So those are some very good basic examples to help you get started.
Let's see. Okay. Yeah, just a reminder here that begin update, end update to increase the speed of rendering. But he's suggesting it's important that you should put those in a try finally block as well. Okay. Portrait and landscape mode. We support that in the designer. There's a little button to toggle back and forth. Then for actual deployment and runtime, under project options, application appearance.
Yes, so there are a couple things. If you want to lock your orientation, so for example, you want a user to only be able to run an application in landscape mode, for example, many games today only run in landscape mode. You can go to project options appearance and you can lock the orientation to a specific orientation. So for example, landscape, I think there's upside down landscape, portrait, upside down portrait.
Yep.
So basically, if you wanted to have just landscape supported, you would select landscape and upside down landscape. And if you want to select all four, and you want the user to be able to use your application in both portrait and landscape mode, you can select all four of them. Generally speaking, if you wanted to have a really different user interface across landscape compared to portrait mode, we have a forms demo example that's also in the multi-device samples user interface folder that shows you how to programmatically load the landscape form or portrait form. So you just have two units, a landscape one and a portrait one, and then you can detect the orientation that the user is running. whether the user's rotating it in landscape or portrait mode, and then you can load the appropriate form.
Would you use the on-resize event
Yes,
for the
the
form?
on-resize event, correct.
Okay.
And we have a forms demo that's shipping with the product that shows you how to do that.
Form. Okay, I'll put some of these, and I'll have Serena look over those. I'll put some of these specific UI samples that are some of the most important ones. You can go look at all of them, but I'll at least give you the folder name to go and explore those. But they're in the samples.
User interface is
yeah.
a really good one to look at, and the one I just mentioned is called Forms. It's the Forms demo. We also have keyboard types demo that I mentioned previously. The multi-view demo. We have a variety of ListView demos. The search the settings project demo is also part of that folder. So in general, if you haven't explored the multi-device samples folder yet, there are many great examples that are, that show you how to not just design user interface, but also leverage things like beacon support, using the new T-address book, using the T-map view control, working with advertising components, working with location demos, location access, etc. So the multi-device samples folder, both for C++ and Object Pascal, are a really great way to get started. And you can find that usually it's under Studio 18.0 samples, and then you select either C++ or Object Pascal, and then you navigate to the multi-device samples folder, and you'll find many different subcategories with great content.
Okay. So a way to build an interface dynamically inside a thread without affecting the main thread for performance. You can do all sorts of things in code. Some people create their forms dynamically in code and then show the form when it's time to show the form. You could put that in, you could be creating all those objects. You could populate list views and list boxes and all sorts of things. Just don't show the form yet. I visited companies that have form descriptor files, and they have thousands of forms, so they don't want to create all those forms physically by humans. They have descriptors, and then they create them on the fly as needed, for example. So then you have a smaller app, and there's not some of that load time to sort of auto create all the forms. So you have all of those possibilities. Everything you see us do in the object inspector, you can also do in code. Okay. Okay. I think there's the question about minimal Android and iOS version required with 10 Berlin. We have all the links to the platform requirements, both for the ID itself and for each of the application targets in the doc wiki.
And the system requirements, correct.
Yeah, and so there's system requirements for the ID, and then there's system requirements per platform where we specify, and then there's also, and I have a link to those in the webinar blog, there's an important one you want to always bookmark and keep track of it. It's the platform status page. It's at a higher level in the doc wiki, and what we do there is every time we release a new version of the product, or one of our platform partners releases an updated version of their operating system, Windows, OS 10, iOS, and Android, we put notes with workarounds and or information notes about what is supported, what's not supported for each of those platforms. I use that page, the platform status page, as whether it's safe to go into the water or not, as I call it. Because people kept asking us, hey, there's this 9.1.2 that just came out from Apple for iOS. Is it safe to use? Or Xcode 6.7.25004. And I'd say, well, just wait and we'll blog about it. But now we have a standard page you can bookmark called the platform status page that gives you all the information about what we currently support. And we're keeping that updated as new releases of different of our products and these platforms. Because, yeah, it's a challenge sometimes to know when all these different pieces and parts are moving, including API changes and so on. So we're keeping that page updated as fast as humanly possible. So check those out. The links are in the blog post. Will a toolbar scroll if there are too many buttons on it?
No, it will not automatically scroll. So I would recommend not putting too many buttons on the toolbar. You could parent a vertical scroll box, but or horizontal scroll box, but I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend placing the required number of buttons, or you could, for example, if you wanted the user to have more options, you could use the T multi-view control. The multi-view can also be displayed as a popover. So, for example, you could select a popover or drop-down menu that you could use off the toolbar using a T multi-view control if you wanted to have that type of functionality. Otherwise, I would recommend just placing a couple buttons. And it's usually a good idea that you can mix and match text buttons with iconography-based buttons, but a lot of times, depending on the functionality, it's good to stick with one style or another. Of course, in some cases, that's not possible, but generally speaking, that's a good idea. If you have a lot of buttons, I think it's a good idea to kind of maybe rethink the workflow of your UI and see if any of those buttons could be, for example, on a bottom-aligned toolbar for additional information rather than having them all at the top. Or if you're looking to do transitions and allowing the user to navigate between screens, as I mentioned earlier, it'd be good to work with tabs, and we have several demos and also blog posts that show you how to do that.
Is it okay to create controls dynamically on mobile devices? Do the Apple people get upset if controls all of a sudden pop up in the middle of them checking your app out?
Well,
like if a button appears. I mean, you can make a button visible, invisible
sure.
based on...
I think visibility is not an issue because a lot of times, you know, that's kind of standard, a standard process, right? Maybe you are allowing the user to go into edit mode. Let's say you have a notes application, and this notes application allows the user to create a new note and save it to a database, and then the user is able to go into an edit mode, right? Maybe when the user goes into an edit mode, you now set the visibility of a cancel button to true that previously wasn't visible. So those types of, that's kind of a standard UI. I don't think that would be an issue at all. That's something that I would expect more to be part of the overall app functionality than anything.
Yep. The T-Web browser component. I know, for example, you can put a URL in, but you can also load up HTML into the T-Web browser, right? Is there
Correct.
other things you can do as it relates to interaction with your code?
Well, we have some good examples of loading HTML files directly using the T-Web browser in addition to navigating to a URL. If you have any specific questions on any type of other ways that you're thinking of using it, feel free to send me an email and explain, you know, what type of interaction or UI you're thinking about, and I'm more than happy to have a look and give you some feedback on that. And I know my email address at one point was shown on the screen here, but it's just...
It should be still there.
I can't tell what that's there. Okay, there it is. Great. You should still see it. So yeah. Serena.dupont@embarcadero.com, and you can feel free to send me an email if you have some questions with some examples, and I'm more than happy to provide feedback on that to you.
I think that's, this one is hard for us to answer. It's really an Apple answer, but maybe, you know, Serena, maybe there's a page you can go to. Is there an average delay or wait time for iOS apps to be approved? Do they give you feedback?
No, that's a tough one, but usually what happens is it can take, I would say on average, about 2 weeks. When you first upload the app through Application Loader, if there's no problem, then it will just go into a process. You can, you know, add your images, you can add your app icons. You can do that prior to uploading the application as well. Then you can submit it, and then it will say your app's been submitted, and then as Apple starts looking at your application, you'll get another automatic notification that says your app is waiting for review, then another one, your app is in review, and then your app is ready to be, I think, released, which is if you set it to manual release, once Apple approves it, you can go in and actually enable the app to appear in the App Store. If there are problems, Apple will contact you. You will receive a notification via email. You'll log into your developer account. There is something called the Resolution Center. That's all just part of the standard Apple process for submitting applications, and then Apple will communicate with you on that process with any questions or feedback they may have.
Yeah, and Marco covered some of that in his part. You can email Marco and Serena if you need more. I know there's been also times where the wait time was longer. For example, if a new major iOS release comes out,
sure,
and everybody's submitting their updates, they may get a bigger backlog. Or every once in a while, they've mentioned that there's a holiday around the holidays time where the reviewers have the days off, so it might take a few extra days, and
sure,
it might be a backlog.
I think in general,
2 weeks.
2 weeks is a good time frame. Android, on the other hand, is pretty quick. I mean, it can be like, a couple hours or so for it to go live because it doesn't go through the same type of a process that the apps do on the Apple App Store.
Again, about virtual keyboard pop-up, it's handling virtual keyboards. There is a platform service interface you can query to see if there's a virtual keyboard. I did a blog post and sample a year or so ago on, for example, a Windows touchscreen system where you can test to see if there's a virtual keyboard and then have the virtual keyboard appear or not, or whether you have a physical keyboard. That you use the FireMonkey platform services interface. There's all sorts of different services. Is there a mouse service, a dialogue service, a window service? You might be on a device in the future sometime where there's no screen. Maybe there's a green light that blinks or a red light that blinks. So FireMonkey uses all of that in its own startup code to see what services are available that it can take advantage of. And the DocWiki, if you search for the platform services interface, will give you all sorts of information about how you can do that in your own code as well.
And then we also have the keyboard types demo, and the keyboard types demo is another example that shows you how to work with a virtual keyboard and also the different types of keyboard options that are available to you. So for example, if you have a web page, field on a form, you can pop up a different keyboard on mobile devices than you would, for example, if you just want the user to enter the first name. So there are multiple different options for the keyboards that you can select from. For example, keyboard type URL, alphabet, email address, name, phone pad, number pad, etc. So those are different options that you can select from with the keyboards. And then we also have another demo here called Keyboard Toolbar, and that demo shows you how to use custom buttons as well. So for example, on iOS, some applications, as part of invoking the keyboard, have custom buttons kind of at the top of the keyboard. You'll see a toolbar that comes across with custom buttons such as next, previous, etc., sometimes used in conjunction with an input form, actually placing those buttons on top of the keyboard. And we have a keyboard toolbar example that shows you how to do that as well.
There's a question about when you're doing a multi-tier application, what happens if you lose connection to the middle tier, the back end, whatever it might be? Can you cache the data? And there are many ways to cache data. You could do your own file saving of whatever data that you've been processing in your client application. And then when you lose connection, save it just in case, or leave it in memory, and then connections sometimes for mobile can go up and down. If you use components like the TFDMem table, there's a method to just save to a file and load from file. You can save it to a binary format and save it to, I think, JSON or XML or whatever. But then when you come back up, you can then call apply updates. FireDAC has a caching option. You can turn on the cache option there. And again, if it's off, then it'll try to send updates as they're happening, or it'll cache them in memory. And then again, you can call the apply updates to do that. We also have apply updates in the providers for EMS, database connection, and also through DataSnap, so you can call apply updates when you're connected again. So it's that we use that kind of briefcase model for storing, but you can also take control of it yourself. Okay. The question about, can you create UI elements programmatically, or does everything have to be done in the designer? You can use the designer and hook event handlers and change values and do all of that. But everything you can do in the object inspector and designer, you can also just do in code. You can create an instance of a form. You can create instances of components and parent them to the form. You could end up with an application that has no forms at all. And when it starts up, your code could create a form and create the components and create the list view and populate it and all of those things. So everything you see us do in the designer, you can also do just in code, or a combination of the two. Serena, I think there was a question, or you posted a note about the list view, the variable height items.
Yes, there was a question that came up in a prior webinar, and we have since created a new demo that you can find in our SourceForge repository that is an example of how to automatically adjust the item height of the list views to fit its content. So for example, if you're hooking it up to a data source and you have variable content, you can automatically adjust the item height to fit the text based on the data that you're using. So we have a great new example that's uploaded and posted to our SourceForge repository under the multi-device sampled user interface list view directory.
Okay, and that URL is in the Q&A log, so people can grab it from there and go out. There's also, I think, in the .wiki, there's links to the SourceForge repository where all the demos are, as well as there are other repositories for previous versions. I think, Serena, over time, we've started pruning out some of the demos. But if you
That's correct.
find older ones, find those branches, right?
Correct, yes. You can access the older ones as well.
So if you remember something from XE4 or 2010 or whatever, there's branches on the SourceForge demo repository, so you can go and grab some of those as well. There was a question about what about deployment other than to the app stores, and I put links in the blog for this webinar that point to deployment options and store options. On Android, you could create an APK and just give it to people. You can sideload it, install it, grab it from a server or whatever. You don't have to go through a store. On iOS, you can do ad hoc deployment. You can also have devices connected to your development computer, and you could go through USB and load the applications onto each device as it comes by your desk or office, and you plug it in. Apple, though, requires a store for deployment. They have this thing called an enterprise store where you can provision up to 100 devices a year and then use ad hoc deploy to connect those to those devices. Ad hoc also helps you if you're doing things like beta test where you're not ready to put the application into a store, put it through the authorization process and the the approval process. So Apple's a little more restrictive, but there's a few ways, including the enterprise store inside your firewall. And there's a link. I put a link in the blog for the webinar to that information as well. I also put, for Serena's part, I put links to a few of the DocWiki entries. I also put links to the Apple and Android and Google UI guidelines for iOS, OS X, and for Android. I think, Serena, in your experience, Apple is more, should I use the term picky or careful about what they accept and how the apps work versus Google Play Store?
Yes, that's very true, because with Apple there's an actual human review process of somebody looking at your application. So once you upload and submit the application, you'll get an email notification once the app is waiting to be reviewed, once it's in reviewed, and then if the app is rejected or accepted, you'll be notified. And if it's rejected, you'll get a notification from Apple. You'll log into your developer account, into iTunes Connect, and you'll be able to see the message that Apple has sent you, and then you can address any issues that they raise, and then you're able to resubmit an updated version of your application for consideration to be accepted into the App Store.
Yep. Then there was questions about devices that may or may not have Bluetooth Classic or Bluetooth Low Energy. In my experience, all the smartphones and tablets that I know of that are, at least in the last few years, have support on the Android side or for Bluetooth Classic and Bluetooth LE. In the case of iPhone, there's Bluetooth LE support. But if you want to use Bluetooth Classic on iPhone, you have to contact Apple and get a license from them. So if you look at our platform support as it relates to Bluetooth, you'll see checkboxes on different platforms like Windows 8.x and later 8.0, 8.1, and Windows 10 has support for Bluetooth LE, but not earlier versions specifically of Windows. But even earlier versions of Windows had Bluetooth Classic support built in. How you test to see if a device has Bluetooth LE, there's probably an API call on each of the platforms, to see if there's a Bluetooth LE support. I don't think there's anything special that we do. There may be a Bluetooth service interface. I'll have to take a look at and see if there's something where you could query through the platform services interface for Bluetooth and Bluetooth LE. App tethering, for example, that we provide has an option for using Bluetooth Classic or network to do connections for app tethering. So we probably do some testing somewhere. I'll see if there's some API hook for testing what is there. I know my Macintosh has Bluetooth LE support, but it's only more recent MacBook Pros that have that. I think most of the Windows tablets that are in the recent last couple of years have Bluetooth LE support built in, even if your desktop computer doesn't. For one of my older desktop Windows devices, I upgraded to 8.1, and I bought a little USB dongle that has a Broadcom Bluetooth LE chip in it, and I just plugged that in a USB port, and all of a sudden I have Bluetooth LE support. The only distinction that I remember from Windows 8.x and Windows 10 as it relates to Bluetooth LE is that you need to use the operating system under devices, Bluetooth. You have to pair between the computer and the LE device and then unpair it again. On all the other platforms that support Bluetooth LE that we support, you don't need to pair. You can just connect and then disconnect between the smartphone, the tablet, the MacBook Pro, and the Bluetooth LE device. So there's that subtle difference on the Windows side. If you don't like that, you can contact Microsoft, tell them what you think. So a question about using JSON with client dataset or FDMM table. Right now we have JSON libraries. JSON is used between, if you have a DataSnap REST module, then JSON is sent back and forth. EMS uses JSON explicitly back and forth. And we have a whole JSON library, as well as BSON support, BISON, for working with MongoDB data types and so on. So check out the JSON library support that we have, Keith, and you'll see it, what you can do there.